specific HHAs where I've identified that as a specific value of the area. I think that whole issue regarding the demolition of simple small buildings, which Ms. Francis raised, may be something we could look at in terms of that issue that I discussed a moment ago in terms of development revere and all those sort of issues. We could perhaps have a look at that. Then the Seifert, yeah, I hear what they say. My feeling again, having visited that area again when the submissions came in, was I still believe that it would be appropriately identified as an HHA. And then I just sort of wonder whether or not some of the issues they raised comes down to that issue of advice to the resource consent planner. And I appreciate the points they've made in terms of the potential additional cost of additional consultants. But I just do wonder whether those changes to the statements, and I chose Seifert as an example, not particularly in response to the fact they were coming today. It's randomly chosen as an example, but I wonder whether or not having that level of detail that's now provided in that HHA would help with those issues, but also perhaps also general guidance regarding alterations and extension, etc., beyond the plan, perhaps, would be something which others have mentioned.
Well, I mean, without putting you on the spot, obviously, you saw stage 3, which she's planning or hopes to develop. Would that cut the mustard in terms of an HHA and your, your
I think what occurred to me with that was the fact that they were adopting a reasonably different architecture for that stage 3 to the rest of the building. Now, that then leads me to a potential issue, I think, arose in terms of what I've listed as key design features of existing HHAs, and they very much talk about the existing shape and form of the buildings and materials, etc. But within historic heritage, I think one of the recognised ways of extending, good practice ways of extending an existing building, may be to do something very different.
It's to be completely different.
Exactly, which looks very much as as an extension of something which has been added to the original building. So what they're doing could well fit within that, but I think that the difficulty is somehow making sure that the resource consent planners recognise that, and which is why I mentioned the issue of guidance, but also recognise that if you're doing that, you've got to do it really well. For it to be successful, you can't just plonk on a transportable building that looks different on the end. You need to think a bit more than that. You've got to really put some thought into it, but it can be really successful. I mean, I've probably dealt with my first example of that where, I don't know, I can't think how old the cottage was, but a cottage which is 250 years plus old was being extended in my first job in about 1990, where they were adding a very different form on the rear of it, and it worked really successfully.
I mean, that is standard practice.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it's how to make sure that the people who are aware of that option, to keep that open. And I think perhaps, we've listed those key design features, but there are other ways of doing this as well, which could be equally valid. And then I think that's it, because I think I've covered off the other issues regarding Haverfield and Fairview Downs.
Just the issue that Mr. Bakshi raised, which is height of fences for security purposes and for that. I mean, what's your response to that? I mean, clearly we've had a number of submitters who've come forward and saying they're really worried that their kids will run out on the street or whatever, a whole lot of things. Is that a practice issue?
It is
I mean, can you have something which may be 1.2, but it may allow a permeable fence above that, for example, to create. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I think that's something we should think about. I think the difficulties is permeable and permeable. If you see what I mean. I mean, if we had a 1.8 metre high, let's say, pool fence, that would allow significantly greater visibility, and if that was available, you know, if it had planting around it or whatever, that would soften the impact. So there could well be instances where an approach like that might be.
I mean, people seem to be quite exercised on fences. It seemed to be a matter that came through time and time again.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the things that struck me in terms of my site visits was the very significant number of tall fences on front boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder whether if you did a survey, you'd find there's a higher proportion of property in Hamilton with a tall front fence than is seen in some other cities in New Zealand, for instance, because it really did strike me that is something you see more. I don't think it often results in good outcomes for the street, but it's finding a way forward through that, I think, is something to consider. And I don't have an answer for that at the moment, but it's certainly in my mind.
Right, you've got 3 months to do that.
Thank you.
Right. Any questions?
I'm just thinking about the fences, and I think you said the other day there's no controls on planting.
No.
So if you're planting that area, you know, potentially some of the houses we've actually been looking at online, there is no visibility due to the amount of planting you've put there. So I guess I'm struggling a little bit with what's the difference?
I think the difference is that some of those areas, and particularly those which are post-war, the open frontage has always been a key feature of those. And at the moment, in those areas that we've identified, and they've been identified in part because of this, it remains a significant feature today, as it did on day one. And I accept there's variation in how much people have then planted their front yards, etc., and the visibility. But to me, with planting, and it's not always the case, there's quite often glimpses and whatever that you can get through the planting of what's beyond, so the building does still make more of a contribution than it would, let's say, than if you had a 1.8 metre high solid fence. And I think the overall impact of a fence on the values of an area is just so much greater. So there is, again, dare I use that word, sort of continuum again, really. There is a continuum from low planting to higher planting to a low fence to a high fence, and there is some middle ground. The difficulty is I just think that there's some areas where the existing open frontages is such a strong feature of those areas.
So why not control the planting of a greater height in those areas if that open feature is such a significant part of that heritage area?
I think the difficulty is, I mean, planting is controlled, isn't it, by rare condition for sight lines and visibility displays and things like that. But I think it's quite a I think it's you know, it's a natural living thing, and are you going to have people going around in, you know, compliance people going around the whole city checking the height of planting? And I just wonder whether it's realistic to.
Well, they're not doing the fences.
Well, no, that's right, exactly. So we've heard they're not doing. It sounds like they're not doing fences. So I think it's just unrealistic. You know, unfortunately, from a compliance perspective.
Yeah.
Speaking as someone who, in a different country, had a notice from the council that my planting was overhanging the footpath too much. I lived down a cul-de-sac of about 4 houses. I don't understand how it was ever picked up, but
right.
No question.
All right. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just one thing on your paragraph 34 in relation to the differentiation between contributing and non-contributing, and whether you can demolish them.
yes.
And the activity status there. And so, I mean, basically saying that your view is you'd want to know what they were going to do on the site, as opposed to having the permitted activity status to get rid of it. And then
Yeah,
it sits there
that's the difficulty,
like
having an empty
like
site.
a missing tooth.
It might have found, you know, they might leave the building platform or foundations or the garden shed still there as well.
Yeah.
So you need to have control over that. And it might be that the creation of an empty site is okay in a particular circumstance, but you need to be able to assess that, I think.
I guess it's still an indication that they are going to go on and replace it, because you can't really force them to build anyway, can you?
No, that's what I was going to ask. How does an RDA cure that issue?
Because you would generally have an assessment. I think the assessment criteria will consider what's happening with it, And I know of cases where conditions have been added at a hearing, for instance, a further condition was added to say that the building won't be demolished until a contract's signed for its replacement.
Wow. All right.
Which in the you know, again, pulling my past life, as it were, that was common practice in the UK, and I've seen it here too. But that's
different regime, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's heavy averse, but the only way you could really fix that is to have a bond for $500,000 to make sure that there was a house.
I mean, ultimately there's a risk, isn't there? Because you put a condition on, and there may be a contract let, but there's not anything to say that money may not dry out and that never happens. But I think it's actually having a degree of control over.
So is there? Sorry, and I should turn it up, I suppose. But is there an RDA matter of discretion relating to the potential for a vacant site? Because
there's an
otherwise
RDA matter.
It doesn't address that.
Hold on, let me just. I have to pull it up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I believe
there is one, I'm sure. I was just trying to double check what the wording was, and I haven't got those open, so just bear with me. Assessment criteria.
There's a cumulative assessment matter, isn't there, about sort of like demolition within
it's
an area?
in Appendix 1.3.3 E10.
Sorry, what was the last one? 133.
1.3.3 E10,
E10.
and then C.
Yeah.
Which states this is for the assessment criteria for demolition or relocation off the site. The effects of the demolition of the building on the historic heritage values of the area, with reference to the statement for the HHA. So point C says whether there is a consent in place for the replacement of any demolished dwelling or commercial building, or whether a contract is let for the construction of this.
Right.
You may note that I wrote that.
I can see the cartoon from the 60s.
Sorry?
I can see the cartoon of the Cossacks marching across the screen. Dear. Okay.
But other than that, I thought your extra evidence sort of hit on probably most of the questions that
Thank you.
exercising your minds, I think.
I attempted to pick up the salient points that needed responding to yesterday, because there was a few of them.
Right. All right. We good there?
Thank you.
So that completes the presentation of the evidence in relation to HHAs for now, and it sounds like there's a series of questions being formulated next week, which we'll look forward to. I should also say that there is some more work currently being done just to close out the questions you had around the notification of new areas that had emerged through submissions. There was concerns about the nature of the mail out and who had been notified. There's a mapping exercise which is being done, which is going to visually illustrate that for you. What I'd like to do, I haven't quite satisfied myself that you've got everything you need in that map, so we'll probably at some stage next week finish and fine-tune that exercise and maybe present it with a short summary statement from a council officer who can explain exactly what occurred. We've also got the letters, copies of the letters that went, which we can provide you with, so it's sort of a package of information to come on that topic as well.
Yeah. Right. Good. Thank you for that.
So that, I guess, draws a line under HHAs for now.
Dotted line.
A dotted line, yes. So we can now, I think, shift to the 42A report presentations in relation to notable trees and SNAs.
Just got to turn the memory banks back on.
Yes, it definitely requires a change of gear, but you're good. And I'm assuming, so you're happy just to keep rolling?
Yeah. No, we will. We'll go through to the end now. Yeah.
So just while the 42A team is getting set, I should confirm, so we've also got Ms Galt, the council planner, proponent planner available also. And the position, as I had signalled to you, was that we're presenting a unified position in terms of proponent and 42A report. So Ms Galt's here if you need anything from her, but otherwise I'll just let the 42A team lead it on.
Thank you. Discuss it. Oh, okay. Because I'm working out where the heck I put things. Right, Mr. Sharman, thank you.
Thank you. We will start with notable trees, which I will lead off on that, and then Ms Buckingham will pick up on the SNA topic second.
Right.
So my name's Craig Sharman. I'm the Section 42A reporting planner for the notable trees topic, and I've been supported throughout by Ms May So. I'm introduced at Section 1 of the Themes and Issues report and also Section 1 of the Planning report, and I reconfirm today that I'm complying with the Environment Court Code of Conduct for expert evidence.
Yep.
So by way of a kind of a 42A report back on the notable trees topic, I'll start with one or two items just in terms of district plan provisions and a few updates in that respect, and then I'll run through some sort of commentary really on the submitted presentations that we had on notable trees and in the order that they presented. So I think from Mr Steve Rice you will have a document titled Notable Trees Section 42 Update dated 2 June, and attached to that is an attachment 1, which is a set of plan provisions, and attachment 2, which is a submitter response table.
Yep.
So in terms of the plan provisions, just to sort of take you back a little bit, there was a statement of evidence from Mr John Redfern Hardesty dated 14 April, and attached to that was attachment 2, which was a table that he had which suggested various plan provision amendments, and then this was carried through to attachment 1 of Ms Galt's statement of evidence, again dated 14 April, and I suppose what became apparent is that there were 1 or 2 of those amendments that had been intended to be made that were not in the version of chapter 20, which was the attachment 1 to Ms Galt's statement of evidence. So the table then, summary of revised recommendations, just picks up all of the amendments that had been intended to be made, and within each row there's then a little note as this was included in attachment 1 to Ms Galt's evidence, or the converse that it was not. So that's intended to be helpful.
Yep.
But attachment 1 to my Section 42 update for notable trees is an updated set of chapter 20 plan provisions. We've done some checks, and it picks up all the various amendments in the table. So I won't kind of labour through there, but we've given you raw references. And so some of these wording changes came out of expert conferencing, and some of them came through just sort of the 42A team conversations that happened following conferencing. And so it's attempting to just ensure consistency through the plan provisions, so use of consistent phrases in terms of kind of qualified arborist and those kind of phrases without creating ambiguity or phrases that are inconsistent through the provisions. And then...
and I should have asked this a lot earlier. In the provisions, there's a bracketed number often which repeats itself. Just what does the bracketed number actually refer to in the provisions? For example, bracket 423, bracket 425 at the end of various provisions. What's the... Just so that I'm aware, bracket 329. I've got no idea what...
The text is per existing asset, bracket 425.
That's the submission number given the scope for the change.
Ah.
I don't know if we've done that.
The submission number.
Yeah, so that's really, I suppose, just a technique that we've used in terms of the 42A reporting, which is really just linking an amendment back to a submission number. So obviously that vanishes from the
So 423 and 425, who figure quite often. Do I deduce that those are council submissions?
Yes, one of them is.
Just wondering. Yeah, don't worry, I'll find
yes,
that out.
Yeah, so that's just
I'll find
intended to be
that
a helpful kind of link.
But does that mean that all submissions that have been picked up are noted and named, or only the predominant one, for example?
The latter.
The latter.
The predominant
Okay.
ones, yes.
Okay, so we shouldn't rely upon that as satisfying. Right, okay. Right.
And then if I can sort of take you through just to one point in terms of attachment one, we heard from Mr. David Nelson. He presented on behalf of the Waikato Community Hospice and made some recommended amendments in terms of impervious surfaces and an ability for a landowner where there was an impervious surface, basically a driveway or similar, within the root protection zone. And I mean, he suggested some amendments that I'm recommending to the panel that we pick up. And in terms of where they are, 20.3V and then Roman numeral 8 and 9. And so there's some wording in there in respect of just providing as a permitted activity a level of repair, maintenance, replacement of existing structures. So you can read the wording of 8 and 9. It's a little different than the exact wording that Mr. Nelson promoted, but the intent is to do exactly what he was proposing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that's located, and there's also in the following provision W, so 20.3W, which is the corresponding restricted discretionary activity rule. There's also at Roman numeral 2, there's some sort of companion wording there. So the intent of all of that is to set a practical and a suitable level of permitted works that a landowner can do where they have a protected root zone across a large part of their property. And if you reflect on Mr. Eisendawn and some of the presentations we had, they don't even necessarily have the notable tree on their property, but they certainly have the root protection zone across quite large parts of the property. Mm-hmm. So that's intended to be a remedy to those kind of issues.
Yeah.
If I can just pick up on one point, there was a question from the panel at one stage regarding 3 rule provisions that are in Rule 25.2, which is the citywide earthworks and vegetation removal provisions. And there was a comment which may or may not be still of importance to the panel, but it was just noting that the notable tree topic, obviously the terminology's moved on and the methodology's moved on to root protection zone and so on. And so I can read out the rule references, but there was just noted that there were some provisions of 25.2 which still referred to canopy of a tree and overhanging and the drip line. So those rule references are 25.2.3K, and then there's also a standard which is 25.2.4.3. But just by way of explanation, I mean, they are significant natural area provisions, they're not notable tree provisions. I guess the question was really fueled by perhaps a concern or at least a question mark as to, well, why is the terminology different, why is the methodology different? I mean, the way Chapter 20 is being put together, the SNA provisions and the notable tree provisions are really not designed to interact with each other. They deal with different situations and they have a different driver. And so spatially they operate in different locations. And so, yes, the SNA provisions do still rely on some of that terminology around canopy of a tree and drip line, and that just really reflects that it's, I suppose, driven by ecological and biodiversity outcomes, and it's quite different in that sense from a notable tree. So the example is an SNA, there's some vegetation which overhangs a fence line, and so it's dealing with that kind of situation, but it's not imposing a root protection zone mechanism as with notable trees.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of the attachment to the submitter response table, so there are a couple of amended recommendations. So since last Tuesday, when submitters concluded for the notable trees topic, there's been various actions going on in the background. So the table sets out the submitters kind of in the order that they appeared. So the Warner Kulas Arias had T167 on Forest Lake Road, and you'll remember they flashed up photographs with the traffic hazard kind of issue. So in response to that, Council's Transportation Unit, a staff member, is now engaging with the landowners regarding that issue. And I don't particularly have an outcome from that yet, but I just want to, I suppose, provide some comfort that there's a process that we have initiated in response. And so that Transportation Unit staff member will liaise with them, they'll visit the site, and I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but there is a process. But in terms of the Section 42A recommendation, the recommendation is still to retain the tree within the schedule. Phil Hanford's just noted there for completeness. Mr. Cameron Gray, so likewise, I suppose Mr. Cameron Gray presented and provided photographs and kind of evidence around the proximity of the blue cedar tree, or the cedar tree on his property, and the issue there was around just the very close proximity between tree and house. The recommendation there actually is we do remove it from the schedule. And
you only just beat us to that one.
Right. Well, that's good. I mean, the recommendation is driven by a dose of pragmatism here. I think as far, I guess where we get to with the arborist is always confirming, yes, it's a notable tree in terms of the STEM scoring, we know that. We had various discussions as a 42A team around what would the interventions look like to kind of manage that tree so that house and tree conflict can kind of continue in a managed state. And I suppose the answers we get back are around, yes, it's possible. There's clearly it's going to be expensive for the landowner. Clearly it's ongoing. There are various things like bracing and ongoing monitoring and sort of branch removal. I mean, there's kind of an endless array of interventions and actions that can be undertaken by an arborist. But I think as a planner, I just think at some point there needs to be a dose of pragmatism in terms of, in the long term, is there a possibility that tree and that house can coexist? And I just think the answer is no. And
it's a very big tree.
It is very large, and it's directly overhanging the house. And so I suppose part of the arborist advice, and I suppose the questions that we asked of the arborists indicated, well, actually the tree is in good health. Yes, it meets the STEM score. I mean, we don't get any easy outs in terms of those answers. No. And so we're just left with, okay, what do we do? So hence the recommendation is to remove it from the schedule, and it enables Mr. Gray to kind of pursue the avenue that he wants to.
Have you circled that background into any sort of qualifying criterion in the provisions themselves, or are you leaving that open?
Well, so it just wouldn't be a tree on the schedule. And so
I know that particular one, but the ability to formally consider health and safety issues, for example, does that are you circling that back into the plan provision so that becomes a consideration in
Well, that's why partly we set this out at the table, because I think what was apparent to us as a 42A team is there is a continuum here, and we have a few tree health issues, and we have some kind of conflict issues, and so and with power lines and so on. So we wanted to be confident as a 42A team that we were applying this consistently and making judgments. In terms of the provisions, I mean, I don't think that tree is displaying. Well, I should say that differently. The arborist advice to me is the tree isn't displaying kind of signs of decay to the point where you would say it needs to be removed through the emergency permitted activity rule, for example. So it's not really meeting any of those provisions that are recommended in Chapter 20. So I don't think we can say there's an imminent kind of emergency situation here. It's just an ongoing conflict that's not going to be resolved.
That's why I'm asking whether in actual fact you've taken that. Yeah, because it's not an imminent emergency, obviously, but it is a significant hazard. So I'm asking whether in actual fact you're recommending that we amend the provisions in the plan to allow that consideration to be brought forward formally.
Well, no, so the answer is no.
All right, well, if the answer's no, that's no.
Earthbrook Properties, we heard from Dr. Megan Borks. This was the Opoya Road tree, and I mean, this is really partly here in reference to one of the other similar situations. So the recommendation is to remove the notable trees from the schedule, and that was due to some conflicts with power lines, and that's in alignment with Mr. Redfern's position. Mr. Reddy was the tree at 242 Grey Street and T8, and Mr. Reddy presented the photographs of the tree effectively right in front of the property. It's a little like the first one, so the process that we're conducting there is Council's Transportation Unit will engage with Mr. Reddy around what the remedies might be. It's a street tree, it's a tree on public land. So the recommendation is to retain it within the schedule. And I suppose part of the background to this is clearly that tree's been there for decades, and so has the house. And so whilst I guess we all accept that the tree has been there a long time and it's gradually getting larger and larger, clearly it's not a new situation. So there must have been a conflict there for multiple decades. And it's clearly an unusual situation in terms of access in and out of that property. But in terms of, I suppose, when I was prompted with the question, well, should we remove that tree from the schedule as the remedy to that situation, the answer for me is no, and hence the recommendation is that we retain it in the schedule.
Madani, I'm not sure, we haven't decided yet whether we're minded to do interim decisions on these matters, but if we didn't, and this wasn't decided by us until later in the year, are these instances, the first one and this one, where we could be updated before we get to a point of decision, because a decision may have been taken already in that interim period to do something different to the tree, so it'd be useful before we confirmed anything that we actually got, the resolution of whatever the resolution is, so we're aware of that. Yeah.
We'll pick that up with the transport team and get them to appreciate the importance of moving quickly to resolve
would be helpful. There's no point in us confirming a tree that in actual fact everyone's decided should be removed or whatever. So, right.
And I think the other relevant point there is because these are street trees, it would actually be council who would be removing the tree, and so if there was a consenting process, it would be council taking the lead on that consenting process rather than the landowner. Then we had Jason McKenzie, that was the Saxton Road situation with the very large trees. I suppose we did a little bit of investigation on that. So there's no submission from the landowner there. There are 2 submissions from neighbours in opposition. The other thing we noted is that it's actually not Plan Change 9 that's really scheduling those trees. They're already listed in the ODP. The recommendation is to retain the trees as notified within Plan Change 9, so retain them in the schedule. The Wise Trust was regarding maintenance plans, and there was a similar submission today, so that's really just noted there for kind of completeness. Likewise, the Waikato Heritage Group. Then on the next page, so the Eisendorns, so they had a property with the large sequoia trees adjacent to Galloway Park. So we had some discussions and made some investigations. So there's an acknowledged mapping error there that needs to be corrected, and that's in terms of the location of those trees. So that provides, I suppose, a small amount of relief for Mr. Eisendorn in terms of that situation, and that the root protection zone would retreat a little bit, but I don't think that really remedies, I suppose, what he sought or the issue that he raised. The rule amendments that I've talked about, though, from Mr. David Nelson, I think does go some way to providing some relief there in terms of some of the, I suppose, the scenarios that Mr. Eisendorn was concerned about. So that's really the response to there. Otherwise, the recommendation is to retain the trees. They're certainly notable. I don't think there's any question about that. It's a large cluster. I suppose in discussion with Mr. Redfern, there are individual trees within that. They all have a different score within the cluster. There's actually a few other trees that wouldn't on their own meet the schedule, but in terms of being a cluster and the impact, And the root protection zone, I suppose we had some discussions around how does the root protection zone be calculated and does that have merit in a situation where you have very tall, thin trees? And the answer was really yes, given that that shape of tree has very significant root growth and root spread. That's how they stand up. I mean, so I suppose we were just trying to understand as a 42A team, is there some merit to the suggestion that the root protection zone does not represent the extent of the roots for that type of tree? And the answer was really, well, yes, it does represent the extent of root spread.
So on that property, Mr. Chairman, so the roof area plus the extensive concrete driveway would obviously give a sort of a building footprint for redevelopment that and that would need to be taken into account, or would be taken into account on redevelopment. That's what you're saying with that change to the impermeable surface?
Yes, exactly. So the wording of those provisions becomes very important there. So it's not some sort of free-for-all, obviously. It's around a replacement and a renewal of structures that are already there.
So it's sort of like an existing use right in some ways?
Yes, it is in many ways. But I suppose providing a level of certainty for a landowner that the existing use right provision in the Act might not give them, where the onus is on them to demonstrate something.
Okay.
So Mr. Meehan, Ross Meehan, there was a tree T52 at 953 River Road. I mean, this is partly here for completeness and partly kind of almost for comparison purposes with Mr. Gray. Yeah. So the average recommendation was there's very clear dieback growth, and hence it should be removed. The hospice I've talked about in terms of those rule provisions. David Manns presented on some trees, a row of trees at Claude Street, and which he considered to be unstable and unwanted, perhaps. The recommendation on that is to retain the trees in the schedule. They are notable. They're not displaying signs of obvious decay, or they're not needing to be removed as a response to sort of an emergency works response. Alison Gray spoke in respect of a row of street trees at Marae Avenue. So I suppose the comparison here that we were asking as a 42A team, well, is that the same or different than Apoya Road? Really through discussions it's apparent it's very similar. So the recommendation is that there's a change there, that actually those street trees are removed from the schedule on the basis that that conflict between power lines and those notable trees is basically a second or kind of unable to be reconciled situation that will require a lot of ongoing maintenance and effort otherwise. So at some point that's not the right thing to do. So the recommendation is to remove that. But obviously we're mindful about how many of those situations are there. We're pretty confident actually there aren't very many. So Apoya Road and this Marae Avenue are the two.
Can I ask a question on that point? One of the narratives we heard quite often from submitters was the lack of maintenance on some of the notable trees. That was what they were asserting. And obviously through this process we are increasing the number of notable trees considerably. I accept that may not be an area of your overview, but I'm interested in your thinking as to whether or not when talking to council, have they shown any indication of their capacity to maintain these additional notable trees going forward? Because it comes with significant funding. And maybe you didn't turn your mind to it, maybe you don't have to, but I just thought I would ask that question.
Yeah, well, yes, we did turn our mind to it. It was most articulately put forward by the Wise Trust in terms of Akariki House on Grey Street. That was Dr. Joan Forrer. Their relief sought was really a program of maintenance plans that are developed and then implemented by council. So Well, I suppose what we became aware of through this process is the council does have an arborist, but it is one person, and so inevitably that one person cannot be everywhere all at once. And so there's, like everything, there are capacity constraints, and I suppose then as a 42A team, what is it that we do? I suppose we try and be very mindful of the impact of scheduling on people's private properties and the plan provisions. But beyond that, as a 42A team, we kind of do feel like we have our hands tied behind our back, because that becomes a funding and a capacity and a priority issue for council as to what extent do they have the ability to or wish to kind of engage a team to do that. So it's a little bit like this morning's heritage conversation, where there's some sort of advisory service. That's really where they submit as a leading council.
Yeah, can I just add to that response? I mean, there have been discussions with the Parks team at council, so there's no question that they're aware of what's going on, and they've been plugged into PC9 and the implications for it. I mean, the first point is that most of the trees that we're talking about being identified here as notable are already within public reserves and are already part of an integrated maintenance regime. So to a certain extent it's business as usual, but that's not to say that the message that I'm getting from the Parks team is that getting budget for this type of activity is challenging at the best of times. And this just puts a real spotlight on that. So they're aware of what's going on. They're aware that annual plan decision making is happening literally as we speak. And so I understand that these sorts of factors are being brought to bear in those other conversations.
I'm particularly interested in the fact that I've heard a lot of evidence from submitters who are saying, despite having these work plans, their perception is the maintenance isn't getting done, and it is raising areas of concern. And so I was just trying to differentiate between feeding that into the political machinery, where one could perceive that it's the Department of Council just wanting more funds, but without adding the public equation where council has gone through this process, we've added more trees, and here's the consequence of that action.
Yes, and I think that creating those connections through the various sort of decision-making bodies of council is really critical. I'm aware of that, I'm conscious of it, and it's no more acutely felt that in this heritage discussion that we've been having.
Thank you.
And then the very last one, Mr. Stevenson did not actually attend, but he did submit a statement, and it's regarding a situation at 3 Hartley Street and a certificate of compliance that exists to remove an existing building, and there's also a notable tree on the schedule, I think on the street in front of the property, but in any respect, the 42A recommendation is not to enable the tree to be removed just simply because there's a certificate of compliance to remove the house, whilst that might indicate a kind of a level of progression with a development project. I mean, the 42A position is that the presence of that tree and the impact in terms of the root protection zone should still be a factor considered. And so that's the end of the table, and that's all that I have. So, if there are questions.
Chairman, just a question. You got anything?
No.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you for that. Recommendations.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I have put through an updated statement this morning, which you would not have had a chance to read. I've at paragraph 4, I've said that I've responded where I've amended my recommendations in response to the submitted evidence and presentations, and I've also made some additional comments in response to some discussion during the hearing about why my recommendations are unchanged. Would you like me to focus on the changes today?
I think so. That would be helpful. Yes, thank you.
So I have summarised the amended recommendations in attachment 1. I have attachment 3 as a clean version of the updated recommended SNA rules only. And then chapter 20 is the same as you've seen Mr. Sharman talk about, which is the track changes version of that chapter. Okay. So I will just skip to paragraph 15.
Sorry, paragraph
15.
1.5, right.
1.5.
I have reconsidered my position on planting of exotics and CSNAs. Whilst from an ecological perspective, Indigenous plants are generally preferable and would contribute towards meeting the target of 10% Indigenous vegetation cover in the city, I consider that the restriction on private landowners' planting activities is not necessary to give effect to RPS policy Eco P2, because the characteristics that contribute to the significance of CSNAs can still be maintained through planting of exotics. So I've recommended that rules 20.3D and F, which address planting exotics, are changed to permitted status in CSNAs. My next change is paragraph 19. My recommendations on the structures that should be permitted within CSNAs generally remain unchanged. However, I have revisited the wording of the provisions with a view to making them clearer for plan users. During the hearing, I get the feeling that submitters did not quite understand sometimes what you could and couldn't do. So I've tried to change what I could to help out with that. Instead of referring to structures for restoration activities and safety purposes, I have now explicitly listed out the structures that I recommend be permitted in the activity table and deleted standard 20.5.8. So that's now been replaced with ancillary residential structures, access tracks and boardwalks, and other structures not meeting the definition of a building, excluding swimming pools. This is really similar to the rules for the Waikato Riverbank and Gully Hazard area, which coincides with some or all of the proposed CSNAs for the majority of submitters that appeared. So I didn't analyse every single submission, but most of the submitters have CSNAs on their properties.
Can I just check too, is swimming pool defined as being those that are underground, if you like, rather than the ones that are just placed on the surface?
The definition of building excludes swimming pools that I think are less than 1.2 metres high. So it's not always a building.
Right.
So then when I put the structures in, I had to exclude
so if you put
swimming pools that were lower.
So if you had a spa pool whose sides are often more than that, that would be captured by the definition of swimming pool? I mean, I'm not trying to be picky, I'm just thinking the sort of things that people might have in their backyards that then create a problem for us.
I think if it required a building consent...
You don't need to answer that now, it's just maybe just to tuck it away, just to check out, because I mean, I know certainly in lots of neighbourhoods I frequent, heated spa pools are becoming more and more frequent, and we wouldn't want to be capturing those, I would have thought. So.
And paragraph 20, just to note that if your structure is permitted, then associated vegetation alteration and earthworks should be provided for, as long as branches and roots thicker than 50 millimetres are not cut, and more than 15% of a tree's foliage may be removed, is removed. Paragraph 21, so the new recommended rules match Chapter 22.3, which are the Riverbank and Gully Hazard Area rules. So just to take you through a summary of what should be permitted without a resource consent in CSNAs, paragraph 22. Pruning or removal of diseased trees and those putting people or property at imminent risk. Pruning close to existing buildings. Removing pest species without an area limit, but size limits for the trees do apply. So pines, for example, that are larger than an area would not be removed as permitted. Any planting of indigenous vegetation in both FSNAs and CSNAs. Any planting of exotic vegetation in CSNAs. Replacing existing buildings without increasing their size. Access tracks, boardwalks and steps. New retaining walls no more than 1.5 metres high, fences and walls. Clotheslines, terraces, patios, garden structures such as ornamental pools and other structures that do not meet the definition of a building. Associated vegetation, maintenance or pruning and earthworks, subject to the size limits. So the main activities that are recommended to be subject to a restrictive regime and potential requirement for resource consent are buildings, any lighting and larger scale vegetation removal. I consider this regime accords with Section 6 of the C of the RMA and RPS policy Eco P2, which require that Council protects the ecological values of SNAs and ensures the significance of the vegetation or habitat is not reduced. I've sought to minimise any restrictions on landowners' ongoing activities, with a side from if they are going to remove large-scale areas of vegetation. And those rules are in attachment 3, and I clean them up to allow the commissioners to consider how they work without all the cross-referencing and submission numbers in there.
Yeah.
I will go through paragraph 25 because it's a change. So I originally recommended that outdoor security lighting be required to be 3,000 kelvins. My concern was around the effectiveness and practicality of the proposed new outdoor lighting rule. It potentially affects a large number of private properties who would need to be able to source the appropriate fixtures in order to comply. And when I tried to go online shopping for the fixtures that would be required, I found it was difficult and expensive to find, and down-facing exterior security lighting was that came with a 2,700K light bulb, or you could find a compatible light bulb to put in there. So I was uncomfortable with placing that difficulty and expense on a large number of landowners when it may not make any material difference, particularly given the existing lighting context. But should the panel be of the view that the market will respond to make suitable 2,700K outdoor lighting fixtures available, I agree that it would be best to replace 3,000 with 2,700. Paragraph 29. I have recommended that to provide a cross-reference to the lighting rules when people are looking at an activity in proximity to an SNA. The activity table cross-reference that was already in there to chapter 25.6, which is where the lighting rules are found, is changed to artificial lighting both within an SNA and within 20 metres of an SNA. So people will then be referred to that chapter of the plan. Should the panel consider that cross-reference to the lighting rules will be helpful to also include in each of the zone chapters, we've run a GIS query and I've put a list there of the zones, operative zones that are in or within 20 metres of an SNA.
But presumably none of those zones that you've notified there have, peacocks probably have lighting provisions in them. They all cross-reference, do they, or do some of them do and some of them don't? So which way are you suggesting we go?
I'm suggesting we just leave it at the cross-reference in chapter 20.
Yep. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Paragraph 31. This is to do with the new information requirement that was recommended for biodiversity activities involving biodiversity offsetting and biodiversity compensation. I've considered the wording presented by Mr. Inger, and I've tweaked my wording to include, in part, some of his amendments. I have discussed this with Dr. Mueller as well. So the 2004 document covers slightly different aspects to the 2018 guidelines, Therefore, keeping reference to both documents would be preferable. Referring to the principles instead of the most recent best practice guidelines is considered to still achieve the intention of the provision, to provide some guidance to inform any assessment. And I have continued to refer to these documents in an advice note form rather than incorporating them as a requirement to be assessed against, just because of potential difficulties in introducing new documents of reference. In conclusion, the statement sets out a series of changes to the recommendations in my section of the Section 42A report dated 6th of April, and the combined revised recommended amendments to district plan chapters will be provided by the Section 42A authors, apart from, at the moment, Appendix 9C, which is, or Schedule 9C, which has the areas of each SNA in it, which we will recalculate following your decision on the extent of the areas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just one of the amendments, the one for St James Drive. Should I see a dotted green line on there or not?
The scale made it very difficult because it was only a very small change.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a Where's Wally thing, isn't it?
It's that flat part against the boundary to the west. So it's just been brought slightly back so it doesn't go over the boundary.
Right, okay.
Ewan, any questions?
No question. Thank you.
Very good. Right, thank you for that. I think we'll digest that obviously later on. Make sure that I don't know. Ms. Gould, did you have anything you wanted to add? You were just keeping very quiet. Yes. Right. Right. Are we there then? Make sure, Dave, you okay? All right. Thank you, 42As. Yeah, that's it.
Procedure. So how do you want to progress matters? Do you want to hear from us in terms of a suggested timetable and process moving from now through to November?
I think that would be a good idea, just to staple that so that we're sure, everyone's sure what the dates are, so that would be useful. Yeah, I mean, it's not, I guess the key thing is going to be the circulation of any new material to submitters, obviously.
And a timetable, for an opportunity for any response in writing, and then
whatever happens,
whatever presentation looks like in November.
Yeah.
The other seemed like the practical issue of the November hearing was just the timing and whether there was enough. That sounds like a matter that we should just take offline between the panel and the city in terms of a few days added potentially, if possible.
Yes, I mean, just get the diaries out and have a quick look at the diaries, basically, to see.
I think it was the 6th November kick-off.
Yes, I mean, it's possible for me at this stage, the week after, although I'm waiting on confirmation of, I'm chairing the Northport expansion hearings for a fortnight, and at the moment that's on Labour Day, but it could flick the other side at any moment, so that'll have to be. You're good? Good.
I'll fit in with.
You're good, and Dave? I mean, if we looked at the week of the 13th, at least temporarily anyway, for an overflow, are you okay with that? yeah, so that looks possible. So as soon as somebody gets that into my diary, Northport can go begging.
Okay, well, we'll treat that as a priority.
Yes.
And do you think perhaps 3 days, say 13, 14, 15?
I think we should block out, for at least 3 days.
3 days.
And keep our fingers crossed.
Mm.
Yeah. So 13th to 15th November is the reserve date. Steve, I better check with you since you're the maitre d'. Are you okay? Do you know?
Yes, right. The 14th will be.
Right. Right. Okay, so that looks doable at this point.
One question on documentation. So Mr. Sharman's attachment 1, that hasn't got all the chapters in it, has it? So I guess my question is, I don't need a hard copy, but have all the updated 42A edits, are they found in one document now?
Gotcha.
I haven't provided the full chapter, the lighting chapter,
Right.
and appendix 1.2 yet.
I mean, it might not be the right time to do that. So at the moment, I'd look at what Mr. Sharman gave me, and I'd look at what was contained in your statement, and just.
I think if, I can just cut across that, I think if you can provide us with a cleaned up version of everything we need over the next few weeks, that would be really helpful.
And that would be trees and SNAs
Yeah,
consolidated
the whole lot.
into one set,
The
right?
whole lot, so that we take out those slight areas of differences between council and the 42A, so we're not distracted by that. So let's get a clean.
But they're still, when you say clean, they're still tracked.
Still tracked.
Yes.
Yeah, a clean tracked version.
Is it?
Yes.
It's not a contradiction in
It's
my
not?
terms.
No?
You've never seen a clean track going toward a Kiwi rail. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no,
So just in terms of
Yes.
direction, can I just ask for until the 16th of June to file a procedural memo with
Oh,
you?
yes, there's no great hurry on that. Yep. And we will do our level best to get you our questions by the back end of next week, noting Charles is gracious. Leave for Monday, yes. Is that okay? Pressure on you there? Right.
Long live the king.
I couldn't possibly. Right, that's accused by, yeah, all right. Well, in that case, I think we're done. So thank you, everybody, and we're adjourned until we're not. Yeah, great, thank you.
Next week. Thank you, panel.
Yes, if you would.
Yeah. All right. Well, me whakakapi tātou i tā tātou nohoanga hei te karakia whakakapi. Paupaua ki runga, paupaua ki raro, ki taku aroaro e. Kia mau, kia ita, kia mau, kia tū, tau ana, haramai te toki, homie, hui taiki.
Thank you. Good one. Right, thank you, everybody.